when Paul was writing to the Thessalonians, he basically was talking to a group of Gentiles, not Jews. So he was telling the Gentiles that they needed to keep the faith in face of their past, which was their past was that they lived in a secular world. So today, we find ourselves in the same situation as Christians. We live in a secular world. So Paul is asking those followers to keep the faith. And that's a good lesson for us today, because we are required as Christians to keep the faith. One of the ways that I want to talk about today in keeping the faith is to sort of identify who we are and sort of tell you 4 stories. In fact, it isn't going to be sort of tell you 4 stories. I'll tell you 4 stories. And you can count them as we go along. The first story is a story about the greater church. Now, I'm telling you these stories because I'm going to have a Sacco finish. The Sacco finish is going to be, I'll tell you the finish right now, is to talk about the pledge card. That's my Sacco finish. So I'm going to get there, and it's going to be, you got to go along with me a little bit. I start with San Francisco, California. I start with San Francisco in the 1960s. I specifically start in 1963, when Martin Luther King was released from Selma, Alabama, the jail in Selma, Alabama, and had kept a commitment that he had made 2 years previously to speak at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco. Grace Cathedral, as some of you may know, sits high atop Nob Hill, right across from the Mark Hopkins Hotel. It's a huge, spectacular place, and one that all Episcopalians can be well proud of. Well, King is coming with every press person in the world to Grace Cathedral that day. And Grace Cathedral fills with many, many people as diverse as you can imagine, but mostly black, and mostly Baptist, and mostly evangelicals. And then there's always the peace movement, mostly unchurched, mostly what I'd call students that were probably at Berkeley with me at the time. Anyway, we gathered there to see Dr. King speak. Now, Grace Cathedral fills, and they're worried about the fact that when the Eucharist comes, what is everybody going to do? How are we going to get them to the rail? Well, the idea was that, of course, the rector or the dean would stand up and say, everybody's welcome. All people are welcome. He thought that would do the trick. Well, of course, it didn't do the trick, because even though Martin Luther King went and took the Eucharist, nobody got out of the pews. Not a single person got out of the pews. But they had prepared for that, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, came, I'll guarantee it looked like 100, but it wasn't that, men dressed in black, who were all ushers, who went and literally grabbed the people out of the pews, just grabbed them out. And they couldn't, they weren't going to deny. After all, King had taken the Eucharist, and every one of those people, every one of them, regardless of their faith or non-faith, experienced the body and blood of Jesus Christ through this church, through the Episcopal Church. That's a story of the greater church. I came back from California to Omaha, Nebraska, and I had a wife, a couple of kids. I was doing okay. I joined All Saints, which is a church I was baptized in. The Reverend rector there was Mark D. McCallum. McCallum was a low church. All Saints was a low church, meaning that we did the Eucharist once a month, and otherwise we did morning prayer. McCallum was never changed that as long as he was there. But I joined the church just pretty much perfunctorily. I always loved the church. It was a safe sanctuary for me, for a number of probably different reasons as I grew older. But in any event, I did this as a matter of routine. And it made me feel good. And I was a plate giver, and I did my part. After all, I was doing my part. I was going to church, I was giving the plate, and everything was fine. And Father McCallum decided that they needed a younger person to run the every member canvas. In those days, we had every member canvas. So we were going to have this every member canvas. And he comes to me and he says, Woody, why don't you do the every member canvas? I said, oh my God, I'm 28 years old. You think for 1 minute anybody's going to listen to me? Because in those days, we invited, excuse me ladies, all the men in the parish to a breakfast. And they all came to this breakfast. And if you didn't raise 80% of what you were going to raise, with that breakfast, you were toast. No pun intended. So there we were, having to speak to these men. Well, there was no way they were going to listen to a 28-year-old kid. It just wasn't going to happen. So I had to have a guy from the parish, a rock-solid guy, to be able to do that. And I found one. His name was John Jack Spray, big, 6'2", 3", 240 pounds. He was going to make the presentation. He really agreed to do it. Don't worry, son, I'll handle this. And so I was in good hands. So the breakfast came. He stood up. He made the pitch, and he finished by saying, now when you consider filling out that pledge card, remember that I am the head of collections for the Internal Revenue Service. And I know how much you make. Or I can find out. Well, we raised more money than we ever have at any time. But I got through all that, and I don't remember, frankly, I hate to say this, I'm not sure I filled out a pledge card. I still think I was a pledge giver. Because I figured, hey, they weren't talking. He wasn't talking to me. I just got here for all intents and purposes. Then now I want to tell you the third story is about attitude. Doesn't involve an Episcopalian, but it talks about the greater voice, the attitude that we have. At the same period of time, or shortly thereafter, I come back from church, get in the car, turn on the radio, and this voice comes across the radio. I mean, it was so captivating, and I'm in the middle of this person's sermon, and he was so fabulous that I listened to him and listened to him and listened to him. And it was a message of positive thinking. And so I listened to this guy, and I drive home, park the car. I can't turn the car off. I cannot literally turn the car off. I have never been so spellbound by anybody in my life. And admittedly, I grew up with the radio, but the guy was fantastic. And so it ends, and they said, you've just heard Dr. Norman Vincent Peale of the Marble Collegiate Church in New York City. Wow. And he talked about attitude. I've read a lot of Peale since then. But what it was the power of positive thinking. It was the attitude. It was an attitude that you have. It's an attitude, and it's best explained by Peale by saying, each morning when you wake up, every morning that you wake up, you get to decide what kind of day it's going to be. That's your choice. No one can take that away from you. Even if it's the worst possible day you could imagine when it's done, you've hit it with a positive attitude, and that will make all the difference in the day. So basically, I believe today, in many ways, it's a combination of attitude of thankfulness and gratitude, but a positive view to the future. We take as Episcopalians, as Christians, as Americans, this positive attitude that if we can nurture it and preserve it is very important. And how do you nurture and preserve it? You, in effect, nurture it and preserve it as Christians, as Episcopalians in the church. I remember my old professor used to say, and he was a Presbyterian, hey, don't worry about where God is because you know where he is. He's right down at 24th and whatever it was, because that's where the church is. Well, that's where God is, and that's where we are nourished. So I take this attitude, right? And I'm going to church. I know I have two. I have two in Sunday school. Maybe I have three. Anyway, so I'm going along, and we get a new rector, Charles L.R. Peterson. Now we have Eucharist every 2 seconds. Two people are gathered together, we have a Eucharist. So it's a whole new ballgame. So I'm going along, and Charles Charles comes up to me one day and he says, how are you doing? I said, fine. He said, well, you like the church? Oh, I said, yeah, what do you mean, do I like the church? I'm here all the time. I like the church. You like the Sunday school? Your boys doing good stuff? Yeah, they're doing great in Sunday school. You like the choir? Yeah, I like the choir. Well, how's the liturgy? Are we doing okay on the liturgy? I said, yeah, we're doing fine. Yeah, and the building going, I said, fine, everything's fine, Charles. He says, well, you know what? If it's fine, why don't you decide to become a member of the church? I said, I am a member of the church. No, you're not, he says. I said, well, how does one become a member of the church that does any more than I do? And he reached in his pocket and he pulled out a pledge card. He said, this is how you become a member of the church. I said, okay. And he hands me the pledge card. And I take it home. And I look at the pledge card, and suddenly I remember everything that I think I knew was coming together for this moment in time when I was like becoming an adult, for God's sake. I thought, you know, why haven't I done this before? I have to make the commitment. This is a commitment I have to make, and I get to do it voluntarily. So I filled out the pledge card, and I filled out one ever since. The pledge card, though, has come to me a concept of freedom. There's a liberation when you sign that pledge card and become part of something bigger than you are, and that you're contributing to it. And you're contributing to it to the best you can. And you're not being excluded by how much you give. You're not being excluded by anything except your own willingness to commit. So I ask that you adopt a positive attitude, and not that you don't have one, but think about it in terms of your pledge to the growth of this church and to growth of this parish, and ask that you give strong consideration to where you are in your own spiritual journey. Thank you.